Good evening, everybody. So this is exciting for me. I get to do a webinar again. I haven't done one of these in quite a while, and my first time getting to co-present with my friend Susie. But we'll do some brief introductions and then kind of dive into our content. And as people show up, they'll show up. And we're also recording this whole thing, and we'll be putting out pieces of it later on in the week and next week, depending on what we like and what sounds good. But Susie and I have been talking about doing this for a good long while, and I'm excited to make this happen this evening. It's been a nice thing to look forward to. But my name is Gordon Corsetti. I am a writer and public speaker. I do that under my organization called Mental Agility. Where I write about mental health and specifically about suicide prevention awareness. And I also do that in my public speaking life. But as with COVID, that is all kind of gone off to the side. And I've been doing more writing as a result. And this was an opportunity to work on a new project and also create some new content for folks who are looking for maybe a new kind of spin on some old ideas with the warrior mindset and where we're going with that. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with Susie, and I'll turn it over to you.
So I'm Susie Reynolds Reece, and I too am a public speaker, which has also been slightly difficult for me. So my specialty is actually in the realm of suicide prevention. A lot of people lump me in with all of the mental health advocates. I think that that's slightly unfair to all of them to do that, but I have extensive background in program development when it comes to actually creating and implementing programming that's effective as far as whether it's substance use prevention, mental health, or specifically suicide prevention. So I'm always looking at new concepts and ideas, or old concepts and ideas, and how we can apply them in new ways. I'm constantly trying to improve the way that I look at how I apply knowledge to my everyday life, and trying to pull from ideas that are already out there in regards to suicide. I think too often we look at it as something that there's not a lot of information on, when I completely disagree. I think that's really what everything in the world is about, living and how to live a better life. And I believe that to be suicide prevention. So Gordon and I got to connected through social media avenues a couple years ago, and eventually kind of reached out and started having conversations, which I have completely enjoyed. The opportunity to have deeper conversations around things that people are typically very timid about. And I think that because of what's happened with COVID, I think a lot of people are having conversations around mental well-being. And I think that we are all struggling in some way. So we started talking about the concepts of the warrior mindset and how it applies not only to our own personal lives, but even our professional lives, and even how others around us could use some of these strategies and skills in order to better navigate a very complicated and scary world right now. So that's kind of where this started at, and I'm really excited to kind of get into these two different I guess cultures, really, and looking at ways that we have both used some of these strategies in our own life. So I'll just kind of toss it back over to you, Gordon, and see where you'd like to go.
Yeah, so we had a new attendee, so welcome on that end, and we're excited to have you. And as Susie said, we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, and kind of got finally got a sense that our schedules opened up, that we could plan out and do our research as well for this talk that's diving into mental health in the ancient world. Before it was termed that, right? I always like to say that all the stuff that we do and talk about for whatever you want to call it, mental well-being, better mindsets, wellness in general, it's all kind of timeless advice because we're still dealing with humans at the end of the day. But some of the ways in which some cultures, and then even individuals in cultures long dead, have said things or set examples that have really resonated across time. I in particular was taken by Greek and Romans, gladiators, and in particular the Spartans in the Battle of Thermopylae, and all the historical fiction that is spawned as well. But also just the interesting thing about just kind of what those cultures are. And how they dealt with the everyday stress of knowing that they could be called up to go to war at any time, and it wasn't so much it was, when you were a part of your city state, that was very much a massive part of your identity, and to take up a shield and a spear, and to go, march hundreds of miles to fight somewhere and not know if you come home, that was very much their way of life. So how do they deal with that in their day to day? But then also is how do they actually go about the act of fighting? And one of my kind of quotes in the research that I've done for this is the idea that war is work, and so the Spartans very much demystified the concept of war for their participants. And I'll give you guys a brief history on the Spartans, and then I'll turn it over to Susie to get her take. It was a warrior culture. And you think we always know of Athens and Sparta. Those are the two kind of the Hellenic Greek major city states. Those are the ones that get all of the press. But the Spartans were known for their particular oddities as a people, for the fact that at 7 years of age, you went into the agoge, which was basically military training. You became a full citizen at 20, when you could actually engage, or 30. But you were expected to serve from the age of 20 when you graduated the school until you were 60 or you died. And not fighting was not an option. The stylized version of the things we've seen in 300 or even in Gates of Fire is that the Spartans were this kind of utopian type society, and we can I can kind of roll my eyes at that a little bit. There's things over time tends to get a little bit blown out of proportion, and what I'm trying to do here, and I think what Susie's trying to do as well, is zero in on the bedrock things that move the culture along. But the idea really for the Spartans was the collective good, and the responsibility of the individual to the overall whole. And that is kind of the foundation, and the research that I've had of how they approached everything that they did, from what they did in their day-to-day to how they trained to how they lived their lives in every aspect of it, and also how they raised up their next generation. So I'll be talking a little bit more about how they did that, but I want to kind of go to and hammer that point of the idea of existing beyond yourself, for reasons beyond just your own good was very much a core of the Spartan ethos.
Thank you. That was great. I see some similarities, I guess, across the two cultures. So I looked into the samurai history, and it's a little spotty to say the least. So I think that there's this concept that we all have that's a very American Western concept of what the samurai is and how it is based in culture and respect and honor and all of these things. And those were definitely parts and pieces of each of the different feudal systems that were across the country. However, it wasn't really a unified start, to say the least. I think that war really ravaged the country, and so there was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a lot of survival, and there wasn't necessarily this codified system of what we think of when we think of the samurai as a whole. So in the 1900s, there was a book on Bushido that was written, and that was essentially propaganda for all of the Western culture. It was so obvious that it was propaganda that the author only wrote it in English, right? He didn't want anyone in Japan to actually read it, because he was like, oh yeah, this is going to be a problem, right? So in Bushido, which is essentially the way of the warrior, they talk about these different tenets that we think of when we think of the samurai culture, which is, loyalty, benevolence, honor, all of these 7 tenets. And that is what is often thought of when we think of that way of the warrior as an entire, historical piece. However, in the very beginning of what became the samurai way, it was how do you survive and who do you survive under? And so we had these feudal systems where samurai were respected, but they were really the low man on the totem pole, and they were in some ways just above the peasant class. And so they had a lot of abilities when it came to what they did above the peasant class, but they were essentially ruled and used as chess pieces. And how do I move you around so that I can get more power and all of these things? So as the history kind of developed and as that culture developed around each of those different, what are called shoguns, which is essentially their generals, some of them had more practical tenets, and so they may have had some classes or some orders that they put together for their direct people, but it wasn't necessarily something as a whole across the culture. So oftentimes when we see anything around samurai culture, it's hit or miss, right? A lot of people have filled in gaps. So Miyamoto Musashi was a well-known samurai. Even his history is like, we're not really sure about most of these things, right? It's just whatever he didn't write, we kind of filled in his life. We're not sure exactly how old he was when he left home. We aren't exactly sure why he left home. It was known that he didn't like to bathe. They weren't quite sure why he didn't like to bathe. Some of them thought that because he didn't want to be vulnerable and naked in the water. Some thought he had eczema. So there's a lot of different things that are going around when it comes to the samurai. And I think that oftentimes when we think of the samurai mindset and the samurai way, we do think of Bushido and all of those tenets. Similarly, when they were young, they started training at the age of 3. That was actually very typical for them to start training, and they would train with wooden staffs. Then they began using real blades and real weapons at the age of 5, most often. And in the Japanese culture, everyone was expected to know how to fight, because in the very beginning it was survival. You could be attacked at any time. They actually had a code, or there was a mythology that if you killed 1,000 people on the roadside, that you would actually live longer lives. So there was a lot of things that happened that weren't necessarily what we think of when we think of honor. However, in that culture, women were treated equally when it came to war. They were expected to learn how to fight and survive, because if the man was out, then the wife needed to be able to protect the home. And so there were a lot of practices with different motivations behind them that really helped to kind of solidify some of these different feudal systems. So as war kept on going, different eras came and went, and we began to have more codified system when it came to the samurais in what's called the Edo period. So that's when we started to see more theory and more philosophies, and they really kind of pulled a lot of different tenets from different things like Zen Buddhism or Confucianism, and those became their doctrines, and those became some of the reasons why. And so those dishonorable things like killing people off on the side of the road became more taboo and less mythology and less kind of accepted as it became a more solidified class within that system. So there's just so many different pieces when it comes to that. And I think that one of the things that I see that's similar to the Spartan culture is, there is a lot of practice. There's a lot of training. They constantly talk about examining self, looking inward. It's not just a model of martial art. It's not just about physicality. It's also about how do we spiritually connect, and what is beyond me as an individual, and how do I serve my entire community, my culture. So I do think that there are some strengths and some definite skills that we can pull from it. Obviously, I think it's better that we stick to the more modern of the historical samurai than the very beginning of the survival. But I think that for me, looking back into the history of it, it shows that you do what you have to do to get through. And sometimes that's not exactly pretty or pleasant, but once you have more capabilities, more skills, more knowledge, you don't have to rely on those more archaic and barbaric lifestyles anymore. And I think that through the conversations that Gordon and I have had, that's part of what we've come to see. Our hope is to continue to learn and improve and be able to apply some of these theories to modern day issues like what we're dealing with right now. So
Couldn't agree more on that one. And to give you got my mind going a little bit talking about how Miyamoto wouldn't bathe. That'd kind of be anathema to the Spartans, even on campaign. So the Spartans were known. So we have this again kind of Americanized, Westernized versions of what these individuals were. You look at the movie 300, and it's like, yeah, all just strapping, glistening bodies, and chins of Apollo and whatnot. And no, not the case. I mean, yeah, they're probably like in phenomenal shape for their, but they're not going into battle bare chested. But one interesting thing that really isn't captured in the movies, but I think is captured in the writings very well, is that the Spartans were known across Greece for their peculiar attire. They pretty much had a uniform as a culture for the men, especially, where they would wear one scarlet robe into battle, and also in their home of Lacedaemon. They didn't call it Sparta; they called it Lacedaemon, and so they would grow their hair incredibly long. And that's one of the few quotes that I could substantiate. I think it's from the historian Xenophon, but he said a Spartan was asked, like, why do you guys grow your hair so long? And the Spartan warrior said, because no other adornment makes a handsome man more comely or an ugly man more terrifying. And but the interesting thing is they would braid their hair before battle. They would take time as they're getting their gear on, with their attendants. They would sing as they get ready, and they would braid their hair. And this was twofold. Number one, a meticulous nature in the fact of getting your physical self prepared to go into something difficult and arduous. But they would also sing as a way to release fear, phobos in the Greek language. So they would use that, number one, also to open up the lungs and get them used to being able to start. It was breath work before we would call it breath work. And the idea for the Spartans, especially when they talk about war being work, is they constantly battled. They were looking kind of collectively to raise what we today call kind of spirit, but what they called Andrea. So it's Andrea versus Phobos, fear, courage over fear, and all the ways that they would do that. I read how they managed and how they approached it. And it's strikingly modern how we're approaching things in our day to day now, with either how the military is training themselves, the police forces are training themselves, but also how athletes and teams are training themselves. And again, it's a human thing. When you're coming up to stress, the Spartans had a name for a panic attack when I'm reading this, called catalepsis, and it's basically defined as terror of the mind, where you lose dominion of the mind, and you just go stir crazy, or you can't do anything at all. And I'm reading this, I'm like, that's a panic attack. And what they would do, all the training that they did, the habit that they got instilled in from a young age that they maintained throughout their day-to-day life, was designed to keep cataplexis, that panic, away at critical moments. But to be able to do that in these very unusual circumstances, one of the Spartan Irenes, kind of a sergeant squad commander, was quoted as saying that the war is just, or fighting is just performing the commonplace under uncommonplace conditions. And the Spartans took that ethos into everything that they were doing. So even when in their training, and again, you read this stuff and it's brutal, right? They would whip the young boys for just about any infraction. They would whip them if they got caught stealing food, not because they stole food, but because they got caught. The idea was to encourage them to become sneaky in the event that they had to forage for food during war across enemy lines. So everything that they did, from a cultural side to the introspection that they had in terms of examining their fears and their reaction to their fears internally, it was all about how they can maintain their fighting formations, and their their courage in the midst of crazy terror on the battlefield.
Well, I think a lot of that, there are some similarities, because in samurai they talked about how after a samurai had what is essentially retired, they couldn't disconnect from war, and so they would isolate and live on the outskirts of the community, and often be found gardening, or landscaping, or doing something that they could kind of connect with. And so I think that we see definite signs that there were mental health issues, but they didn't have any necessary understanding of what that term was, or what that really meant. They just knew. But what I do see too is there was an acceptance of that, and it
Mhm.
wasn't something that they were forced out. It was just simply that this is what they're doing because this is what is best for them, and that's fine because they've served, and this is what they deserve, as far as that peace that comes at the end. But I see, in some of, especially once they started, as the samurai started to become more of a cohesive concept, how they did everything that they could to connect them spiritually beyond just that physical aspect of war. That's why it's called, art. It's not just about the physicality of being a warrior. It's also about the code that goes behind it, and the reasonings that are behind it. And those concepts are really important because it grounds them when they have those moral issues of killing or taking another life. How do you keep them from having moral injury, which we know is definitely an issue, especially in modern day. So I think it's really interesting to see, these things have been around for a long time. We didn't exactly know what it was, but there were ways of trying to approach it in some cultures, and I think sometimes they probably did better than we do now. I think we're more aware of the issues. I just don't know that we have formalized ways of sitting down and putting in practice what they were doing necessarily.
Well, I agree with you on that one. I think part of we look at, I was reading an interesting anecdote from, I think it was General Petraeus, um, who just noted, over the last 50 years, even, just looking at the United States, in an all volunteer army, which is in and of itself is a fairly new concept when you look at human history. If you either conscripted or in some ways you're fighting for the state. Um, but the amount of people in our volunteer services has consistently decreased. Now it's almost like a fraction of a percentage of the majority of folks. And so I think the individuals who would be in those positions would probably look at what you and I are talking about right now and be like, yeah, this is the cost of being successful in battle. Regardless of what you call it or not, you're going to look for every possible edge that you can find that your enemy might not have access to. And the I think troubling thing for us now, especially in the age of COVID, is any of our external enemies that we might have run into. Maybe has become very much, I think, an internal battle. I know I've had that experience where I really right now can't blame anybody for how the course of my day goes because nobody's involved in it. And so how am I then speaking to myself, and how am I looking beyond myself to be able to do the things that I feel are important? But I think one of the things for us is just that the security that we now have on an individual level in the developed world has led to different types of stress. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's stress. And so if we can take these elements from these other cultures, current or past, that have worked in an extreme situation of war and violence, we can probably turn those around to some measurable effect in our day to day.
Well, I agree. And I think too that, I work a lot within military and law enforcement populations, and I feel confident to say that a lot of them have been impacted by post-traumatic stress. Whether or not they've got a disorder is, 100% on their own personal knowledge. I can't say that, but I know that they've all been impacted by trauma. And I think that when we look at, like when I looked at some of these cultures and what they were doing or not doing, a lot of it came down to, not only studying their skill, but learning about other skills as well and how they connected beyond just what their purpose was, and seeing the purpose be in a cultural standpoint, right? I think that it's safe to say that our society has a lot of issues right now when it comes to the warrior mindset and law enforcement, all of these things. And I'm definitely not speaking on either side of that issue. But at the same time, I think that um, the culture as a whole, it was an accepted part of it, and they understood the purpose. And those who were within the samurai class understood their purpose, and they were connected in. And there were certain codes, right? And it was across the board, whether it's on the feudal level, at a smaller level, or as they became more codified. But I think that that's where I struggle with some of what we see through what's happening out in the world, but then on social media in particular, there is a disconnect between respect and purpose, but also it, they are a part of the community, right? And you can't just ostracize them. And as history expanded and our capabilities expanded and war changed, and we didn't necessarily fall back on war like we did at the beginning, that role changed and evolved as well. So you see what was a warrior now becoming a part of the bureaucracy, and they are part of the government, and they are helping with law and helping with reform, and they are becoming educated, and they are serving in different capacities because that need changed. And I think that there's a difficulty there because we've all been forced to change at this point, whether we wanted to or not. But the more we resist that change, the more we're warring within our own culture. And I see that is an issue, because if you just look at the trajectory of this entire culture, those who failed to adapt died off, period. And those who did adapt, they became very much a crucial piece of that entire society. But they also continued to showcase their skills. I mean, they continued in martial arts. It wasn't used in the same capacities. Some of them continued to wear their armor and things of that nature to kind of showcase what they had been before, even though it was more of an ornamental nature. Similarly to the Spartans, they were doing their hair. They called it bouffant in some ways. You know, they were dressing up and showing off. And that in itself garnered some respect. And I think that that's where I see within this concept of what we're talking about, there are a lot of individual things, strengths that we can get, but as a society as well, I think that there's some lessons that can be learned on top of that. So,
Well, I think one of the again, going back to the point I started with here is the importance of that collective is, I think that maybe one thing, and I still think maybe is part of the overall human condition, or the best space of the human animal, for what we're expected to be, of feeling like we are part of something greater than just I, and to an extent that, now everybody has their own individualized life, and we're all kind of going a little bit nutty right now because we can't escape that individualized life. And that's, if all we can identify is that, then that starts to break down, then really who are we and what are we doing? You got my mind going of, so when the Spartans would train, as a either as companies or throughout, or with whole armies, they would purposefully pick the worst possible terrain for a week, right? To piss everybody off, for sure, to make it the worst possible thing they could. And that has stayed true through military training today, where they at the high end levels, they put you through the ringer, right? For a good reason. But the Spartans were interested in that the way they, and also the Greeks in general, fought was in the phalanx, and it's basically a human tank when you get down. That's the one thing I think that the movie 300 did when they showed kind of those guys just crushing people in a line of metal. That was pretty accurate, I think, in terms of how that probably went down. But the idea was that there was never a break in that chain, no matter what the terrain was, no matter what happened. A Spartan was always shielding the Spartan to his right with his shield. So it was your shield, but it was for the man next to you, and then so on and so forth down the line, and then all those shields then represented, the battle line that protected all of Sparta. There's this, I think it was when Leonidas marched to Thermopylae. He might not be attributed to this quote, but it's close enough that, as the bards say, no Spartan woman has ever beheld the smoke from an enemy's fire, and it certainly isn't going to happen, now. But the idea was that this being, knowing to your core, I am an individual and I am a part of this, bolstered the individuals in times of stress, and I'm sure in times of personal sorrow and difficulty. And I think that's something I certainly can speak to in my own life, where it's, I lost refereeing when the lacrosse seasons and all the sports shut down. And so all the people I was connected to in that space went away. When I graduated from this treatment center that I was at, and I was around 100 or so people that were all actively working to improve their mental health or addiction recovery, whatever they were in, you lost that. And so what I'm trying to do, and again, inspired a little bit by now by the samurai, by the Spartans, of seeing what I'm connected to and making a greater push to make those connections stronger. Whether that's more conversations with my friends, whether it's doing this type of webinar and preparing it with you, or working on other projects, it's I'm taking far more time to get connected with other people. And while it's not for preparing for battle or to stand a line and shoulder a weapon or a shield, the principle is still very much the same. And I think if there was one thing that we could do on that, is that I think is the thing that people hurt the most when they lost their teams and they couldn't go back to school, and that connection is a real letdown for folks.
I agree, and I think too that there are different types of connections beyond just interpersonal relationships, right? And so one of the things that I've noticed, if you look at Musashi, he talks about the importance of continuing to push yourself and on a personal level, education, we can call it that, right? Make sure that your mind isn't getting dull, just like your sword could, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that is part of the issue, because we have so many tools and technological advances at our fingertips, but are they sharpening anything? Are we using them purposefully, intentionally, or are we just scrolling on Facebook, right? And getting
I know
angry,
I am.
right? I literally yesterday I was like, just too much time. And so I think that's the difficulty, is routines and practices can keep us grounded. And then when we lose sight of those things, we have to put those structures in place on our own. Like, you can't blame any outside forces anymore, right? So that means that's on you to kind of put that daily habit into place. And that doesn't mean that it has to be the same habit that it's going to be in a year, but it may be something that is helpful for now as well. So what I really enjoyed kind of looking at, and I pulled this part from Musashi, for what we do as public speakers, and I don't remember if it was you I had this conversation with or not, but another person, that I miss speaking in public. And I know that there's an energy that is there that you don't get this way, in the same exact way. But I fear getting rusty. I fear saying too many times. Not being able to stand up in front of people, and the way that you stand and the posing and all of these things. And so I was looking through some of what, like, Musashi's five rings and talking about stances and the importance of breathing and the importance of posture and all of these things. And I thought, this is really applicable just on a personal, professional level today for me. And there are things that I have done while driving from one engagement to the next and trying to ensure that I'm sitting correctly so that I'm not, standing awkwardly in front of people whenever I do have to speak. So I think that there are ways to connect with what we do now with some of these theories and in a way that is useful moving forward. And the other, for me, the other side of that devil's advocate side is, I think too that it's okay not to do anything and not to find purpose in everything. I think sometimes we need to have mental breaks, or we will mentally break. So I think that it's all about what is best for you and your needs. And for me, and it sounds like for you too, structure is important, routine is important. Finding those connections that kind of ground us back in our own purpose. I know it's difficult for me. Other people are like, well, just give up your hopes and dreams and go sit in a cubicle somewhere. And I love what I do. I can't not do that. This is my purpose. This is my passion. And so for me, when I'm reading, I'm constantly thinking, well, how do I apply this in this way? And how do I make use of this? Or if I'm watching television, I'm trying to apply it in a way that's going to be helpful, or that I'm going to glean some type of information. And there's a lot of times where I'm just scrolling on Facebook, but I think that connection capacity, we can't necessarily stand in front of a crowd of people and have conversations right now, but we can find connection in smaller ways as well. I think that's a piece that I have enjoyed as well, as having these types of conversations and throwing out ideas and concepts and seeing if I'm absolutely just off my rocker, or if other people are like, oh, I never thought of that, or I have thought of that, and seeing where that goes. I think that for me personally, history has always been one of my favorite lessons to look into, because there's so much information and depth of knowledge when it comes to some of the issues that we're still facing today. And there are so many people that have had their lives completely turned upside down right now. So how do we show them what routines and practices could be put in place if they want those things? How do we offer those types of connections that can kind of ground them as well? And how do we open up conversations like these that will interest others, if at all? I don't know.
Well, again, I've being a history fan myself, of especially when I look at it through the lens of therapy. And I feel like I've been in therapy since I was about 16, and I'm 32 now, and I feel like I'm kind of good at it at this point. But it is exciting for me to experiment with different modalities. And when I went to this last treatment center last fall, they're like, "Do you want to do cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy?" And I'm like, "I've been doing cognitive for 10 years. I don't want to do that anymore. Let me try dialectical." And the interesting thing is, reading that, and I've got stuff on my site for it, is how much all of these aphorisms or maxims or axioms that come from samurai philosophies or Vedic philosophies or Greek philosophy, it looked a lot like DBT when I broke it down. So one of the key things that the Spartans would do was, they when they were on campaign, eliminated downtime, mainly because the idea was that action breeds more action. Right. So, if nothing else, shine your shield, because a shiny shield is going to look scarier to the enemy from far away. Right. But they also, to your point of taking a break before a campaign, they had designated days where they could just go off with their family in the hills and hunt and do whatever and live. Right. And do the kind of their version of being unplugged from what their warrior culture was. But I look at DBT now and how much of an emphasis in dialectical therapy is focused on doing something, and that can be a small thing. I mean, I've got this goofy thing. See if I can open it. It's gonna be very hard to open. It's very tight. Okay, I can't open it right now. But this is a goofy thing. So it's called Gulab, So I just got this from Target. They've got like five of these things, and it's one of the concepts of DBT is to ground yourself with five senses, and when you're feeling stressed and that catalepsis, that panic attack bit there, and so feeling too freaked out over what's going on is to ground myself in the present with practical action. This isn't very practical, but for facing the mind, like squishing this colorful goo in a it takes me out of that mental lock. And same, I mean, this is the principle behind every squeeze ball that we've had, but the underlying idea behind this has been known for centuries, and I think it's still important that we give credit back to that, but we also look at the fact of um, when everyone's just like, "Oh, that can't possibly work." I'm like, "No, no, this is grounded in some in some
Science and
long known
history.
history." Yeah, this is well done. So I get a kick out of that.
Well, it's funny because I don't fly well at all, and it's odd. I used to fly all the time when I was younger, and I don't remember having issues, but I have terrible, motion sickness. And so I was on my way to Vegas one time and had some putty, and someone was with me, and she was like, "You're white." I was like, I'm just sitting there like, don't look at me. Don't let it go. All I'm thinking about is don't get sick in front of all these people, right? And so she had someone was like, give me that. And I just sat there for a little while because I knew that if I could focus my attention on everything else outside of what I was feeling, that I could essentially not be so caught up in that anxiety, the panic attack that was happening. So I completely agree. I know that happens, and I've taken to doing origami as a skill to it has multiple uses, but for transitioning, but also if I get a little overwhelmed, it's a wonderful because you have to focus on it. You have to pay attention and take the time necessary to make the folds the right way. So I completely agree. I think that it may seem like a silly thing that you grabbed at Target, but sometimes those are the best things to do. And there's so many different uses. It's great for one of the things the samurais did was they talked about the importance of using their hands constantly, not just for reasons like this, but it's important to constantly be thinking about battle. And if you let your hands get rusty, then what are you going to do when you have to pick up your sword, right?
Mm.
And so there's different ways of doing that, and that sometimes look like calligraphy, or it looked like origami, it looked like things that had nothing to do with their actual practice or their actual war. But sometimes that's what we need mentally, is those little breaks that don't look like whatever else it is, so that we can kind of step outside of what's really just our brains overheating essentially. So I like that quite a bit. I think that that's a very useful thing.
Well, I think one of the thing that struck me in terms of again how the Spartans mentally approached battle, and breaking it down into its constituent parts. And now there's buku number of books about breaking goals into smaller and smaller goals and stuff like that. So it's like this stuff has been known, and it's just every generation puts its own spin on it, but the bedrock principles remain. But I think the kind of the interesting one. So there are some anecdotes of battles where um, the the Spartans would kind of stand ramrod straight and just kind of wait until they did their they would sacrifice either like a goat or a chicken before the battle for the gods, and to bless the potential victory, whatever they were doing. Um, but they had their regiment, they had their routine, they never deviated from that. Whereas, and I've seen this from an athletic standpoint as well. I've ref for the last 13 years. In high school, especially, I can pretty much tell the teams that are going to win in the warm-ups. The ones who are doing things in a methodical fashion, who are moving. Um, they're not moving hurriedly, but they're moving quickly. But they're not rushed, even though they're moving quickly. And the ones that kind of still get all just jump up and big um, that's what the Spartans didn't want to have happen. They expected states of mind and false bravado or false Andrea, pseudo Andrea, to evaporate in the heat of battle in that competition. And so their use of repetition of measurable actions, of behaviors that you could be called out on for not doing, could be very if those are trained, it becomes rote, and you don't have to train them anymore. Right, and that's when I'll look at teams warming up, and I'll start seeing which ones are trying to make themselves bigger than they are, to raise up to the moment, and which ones are doing the things that they've just trained to do. And more often than not, they're the ones that come out on the winning side. And I'm just kind of still fascinated by the idea that to win at anything is still very much realizing that motivation or your inspiration to go ahead and do something. I know my motivation, inspiration is flagged seriously throughout this entire pandemic, but also I've found moments of what I've productivity even when I wasn't feeling my most upbeat, because it's things that I enjoy, the things I know I'm good at, the stuff that I've practiced, and to stick to that. Like my thing is I will write, and if I'm not writing, then there's going to be a problem, and people know to check in on me with that thing. And so I think knowing that you do origami, that's one of my check-ins with people. And again, another way for connection is like, hey, have you done any of your origami lately? If you're looking especially stressed or something like that, or hey Gordon, when was the last time you did your writing? Or to other friends, hey, when was the last time you threw the ball around with your son or something like that? Like those are the types of connections that we actively have to work harder on in our culture generally now, just because we're distant from one another's daily lives all the time. But certainly now, when we're just living, inside of our own four walls, and it takes that extra effort to reach out to that other individual. So I'd say definitely like share the things that you're passionate about doing, big or little, with the people you care about, and make it a point. Like, hey, check in on, have I done this thing yet, right, or recently.
Right. Well, I think 2 points. So back to your earlier statement, there's a concept kendo within the samurai culture as well, where essentially it is your practice is the way of the sword, and it's beyond just the techniques, right? It's examining your opponent before you actually even pull your sword out, and kind of calming that anxiety, that build up, that adrenaline, using it very methodically. But then to your point about the connection piece, I think that's important, and that's something that I have. When it comes to suicide prevention in particular, I get very frustrated in the field, and sometimes I say things I'm not supposed to, but I don't believe that we're actually really doing prevention. I think that we do intervention. I think that we wait until we're concerned, and then we say, are you having thoughts of suicide? And no one wants to have that no one wants to have that conversation, right? So what you're talking about is what I've been talking about for a little while, which is, we have to really start doing prevention, which means actually looking at the people around us and having conversations about things that we enjoy, trying to figure out, does this person I care about have enough connections? Does this person that I care about have enough support? And how am I checking in on them? And quite frankly, I think because of the situation that we're in, that our communication has been impacted greatly. I don't think that as a whole that we've been great about communicating in general, but I will say that I feel like I often say things that make people uncomfortable, not because I'm trying to offend anyone, but just in the manner that I speak. And so one night I went and trained, and I was talking about how I hadn't slept, and I don't do well when I don't sleep. And so, forgive me, it's just my brain doesn't function. It takes me a little while to get from thought to thought and be cohesive and not ramble. And the person across from me just kind of, and I thought, well, these are the conversations we should be having. And it is somewhat vulnerable, but it shouldn't have to be. I think that if you know that I don't do well when I don't sleep, then that's an easy sign, so that when we set up and we're like, hey, I haven't slept, then you know where I'm at. And if I haven't slept in a while, then you can check in and say, hey, what are you doing to fix this? How can we have this conversation? But knowing that you are okay if you don't write, That's a way easier conversation to have with someone than, are you having thoughts of suicide, right? Like, hey man, what have you been writing lately? Oh, that's cool, tell me a little bit more about that. Or you haven't been writing, is there a reason why? um, can we maybe come up with an idea together? Maybe we can shoot some concepts back and forth, like, how can I get engaged in this and help support you in that way? Because sometimes we're all drained of energy and we don't have that motivation. But isn't it something that you can see when someone's passionate about something that they really enjoy? I saw a meme earlier and it was talking about how everyone has some random thing that they just light up about, right? And it was like, I know a friend that was talking about a video game and how they did this one mod and all of a sudden it changed the entire game, and they were like, I had no idea what they were talking about. And then a friend's mom was talking about the Audubon Society and how this one way that they're now classifying birds has completely thrown the entire bird watching society into upheaval. And I'm like, that, who even knew that that was a thing, right? But isn't that interesting to be able to know that people are out there running around with these interests and these passions and have information about things that we don't know? And how do we connect in those ways that are, I feel like, more meaningful, less vulnerable, less scary, right? And to me, that is prevention versus waiting until you're worried that someone's not okay and having a really uncomfortable conversation with them where they may not want to tell you what's going on. So I feel like there are better ways of doing some of the things that we have been doing because we didn't know what else to do, right? I think that when it comes to like practice and looking at these cultures, there's a lot that can be learned still and applied and even modernized. But even more simply than that, I think that we need to do better about the way we communicate with one another and what we allow and don't allow within that concept of communication. Because I've learned a lot about the way that people perceive things, and we don't all hear the same word the same way, right? It's like you and I had this conversation about debriefs the other day, and I asked, well, what type of information do you look for? Because just because we have a conversation after something has happened doesn't mean that you and I are looking for the same kinds of information. And if I tell you one thing, you may walk away thinking, well, that's not at all what I wanted, and I think that went well. And we've got an issue there, right? So I think that there has to be a better way of doing those things, and I think through that we'll find stronger connections that we might have not found before all of this happened and we were disconnected. So I'm not sure. I don't know how we can increase that or improve that or showcase that in a way that's I feel like it's easier, honestly. I just think it is, but um it has to be deepened in some ways too.
Well, I have to. So this is wasn't sure if I'd asked this question, but your um, last bit that you had there got me thinking on this end. So I look, especially when I look at these warrior cultures, having read the Book of Five Rings and the Art of War, and what I've read on Sparta and general warrior cultures of, and this is a thing that I do think is mostly lost in our now developed kind of world, is that these were individuals and these were societies that had to stare death in the face. And one of the best, one of the few quotes that the movie 300 got right was when the Persian guy said, "Hey, our arrows are going to blot out the sun." The Spartan warrior quips, "Good, we'll fight in the shade." That kind of nice gallows humor that, if you're gonna hang, do a jig, right? But even looking at how the samurai approach the inevitability of death, and how, where I think culturally, certainly Western culture, has tried to push that back as much as possible. And we tiptoe certainly around that, and I think that also is a part of having some of those more difficult conversations, maybe not up to that intervention point of suicide prevention, but even just that little bit of like, I'm worried about this guy, but I'm not. I can't. I hope he's not thinking about doing that, and we don't put words of just like, I'm worried he's going to hurt himself or hurt somebody else or cause their premature extinction because we've pushed non-existence now so far away from what we do in our day to day. I'm curious what your take is on that from suicide prevention, but also in your readings with samurai of how that's different in our cultures now.
Well, there's and I cannot remember the title of the book, but there's he studied death and dying, and his name was Sherwin Newland, and he actually talks about how we have sanitized death,
Hmm.
which is essentially what you're saying, that we've so far removed ourselves from the reality that we will all die one day, that it is a shock when it happens. And they talk about within different realms of suicidology, how the common modern man now may lose someone close to them once every 20 years. Now, I don't agree with that, but I don't know that I'm the common person either,
Hmm.
unfortunately. So I think that we definitely have, and if you look at it, hospitals are sanitized. We put people in hospice. We do absolutely everything that we can to um, put them at ease, at comfort. We remove ourselves in the grieving process. I mean, there's so many different things, and I do believe that that is definitely a big part of it. I think in the samurai culture, you're right that is number one. You are going to die. You must accept that, and it is just a matter of time. However, there are all of these things that you can do to be the best at what you do, and we are going to train, because you will die if you don't train.
Yeah.
You will die if you don't know your enemy. You will die if, all of these things. Whereas in our culture and what we look at now, how often do we talk about that, really? How often do we have these conversations? And when it comes to grief in general, I can definitely speak to the fact that no one knows what to say. There's never a right thing to say, but people tend to step backwards instead of lean into. You look at samurai culture, and they have seppuku, and Eastern and Western way of looking at suicide are totally different, and you cannot address both those concepts in the same way at all. However, I do believe that they were very much tied to the reality that you are going to die, and it is something that must be accepted. I don't believe that we have accepted that. I think that in some ways it is a matter of control, and no one can control death. So I think that that's part of the issue when it comes to Western culture. I think that that's a very good question that you had, though, and I do agree with the way that you've looked at it too. So
Gotcha. Well, we're kind of coming up on our time here, and I know I could certainly talk about this stuff, on and on, but we do have our lives, and being smartly regimented with our time is a good thing. But um, uh, I guess you want to wrap up with last thoughts, then like how people can reach us if they want to.
yeah, I think for me overall, what I have seen is it's important to put routine and ritual in when possible, and if you can connect it beyond just a single purpose, that is how you kind of stay rooted. And then I think that we see community is built in, in both of these different cultures. I think that you can't just see it as you being the only person. It's about service, and that's what samurai is. It means servant. So I think it's really important that we look beyond just ourselves, because when you lean only on yourself, you'll fall. But if you look to those other people that are around you, sometimes that means lifting them up, but sometimes that means that they can lift you up too. So that's kind of my take on this conversation, and I do think that this is something that we could talk about for much longer, but I might have a different view at the next conversation, but that's kind of where I'm at right now. So I guess your thoughts, and then I'm happy to share a couple of resources.
Sure. I think the big one that still comes to me is that feeling of assigning yourself to something again more than just your individual thing. We can all have our passions that we do enjoy, or the rituals. My morning coffee thing that is sacrosanct for me, and how I do that. That's very important for my day to day. But that isn't really tied to other people. And I think that is the nature of human beings, is the social animals that we know we are, the social primates that we know we are, and that these cultures, the Spartans, the samurai, other warrior cultures, and now our warrior subcultures in modern days with military, with police, shoot, any small tactical group of individuals fighting something, be it other people or nature, um, have to lean on each other. And I think when we look at that stuff, we kind of remove ourselves from, oh, I'm not in a violent situation, or I'm not fighting fires, um, or whatever it is that you may be doing in your day-to-day life that isn't this extreme of a human experience or conflict, um, doesn't mean that you can't utilize the techniques that have been proven to work at those extremes. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit can go a long way for you in that way. So I think those are kind of my overall takeaways there. And then just still kind of just looking at history to inform, your present, and hopefully leaving something that other people are going to remember you by, and does some good down the road.
Yeah, maybe one day. So I actually I already had this book, but I pulled a little bit from it when I was kind of researching. This one's the Complete Musashi, um, and it
Hey,
has the Book of Five Rings, and I liked it because they did an introduction and they kind of went back through what could have been part of his history that tried to fill in some of the blanks. There's still a lot of blanks that are there, and then there's a lot of question over how some others filled in some of those blanks. But what I really enjoy is he lays out his code essentially, whereas some of the other feudal systems may not have had anything in writing or had anything solidified, so it's a little bit harder to find actual codes. Bushido is really a concept that came very late to the scene, and so it's not exactly I wouldn't say it's a great point to look at as far as the actual practice when it came to samurai culture. But I do believe that there are a lot of tenets and wonderful concepts that come out of it. It's not exactly um, a good representation of that. So for mental health resources, though, always the 1-800 number, which for the United States is shifting. So it's currently 1-800-273-8255, and it will shift over to the 988 number. And that should take about 2 years. I believe both numbers are still active, but eventually that 800 number will be no more, which is much easier number to remember is 988. I do recommend don't accidentally dial 911. That two different systems. So,
yeah.
and then you've got the crisis text line, which is 741-741. If anyone is looking for any kind of services in their area and they're not quite sure where to actually go, you can actually go to SAMHSA, SAMHSA.gov, and there's a locator, and it'll be able to help you find any type of mental health or behavioral health services in your actual community. I always recommend going local first. But some people don't have financial capability or resources, or feel secure going to a local facility or any of those kinds of things. So those 800 numbers and those free numbers are always there should you need them. Um, can you think of any other resources that would be helpful to share, Gordon?
I kind of always reference NAMI.org, or the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, since I'm one of their field advocate volunteers as well. Um, but also, if folks are more comfortable reaching out on an individual level to either yourself or myself, we're certainly have an open door thing there. I'm more of a space where, I'm not going to probably help you with whatever your problem may be, but I can certainly point you and to the directions where there are far more people with far more expertise than I do for treatment.
Right. Well, I'm definitely not there for treatment.
Yeah.
I am certified in pretty much everything you can be certified in when it comes to suicide prevention. However, I will say that that's one of the boundaries that I've had to strengthen, especially during this pandemic, because I have a lot of people that are in my actual circles that have needed some support. So it's important not to pour from an empty cup. But I think there's a lot of resources out there. AFSP.org is wonderful, and they've got a ton of different opportunities and books, resources, all kinds of things. AAS is also another good source. I will say that when it comes to virtual, like COVID, mental health, that kind of blend, the National School Psychologists website is really good. And they actually have some free webinars and free YouTube videos and free PDFs and things as well. So if anyone's looking at how do I notice if someone I'm concerned about maybe acting differently through a Zoom call, what are some of those signs? And then how could I have that conversation, or how can I kind of be more aware? So that's probably the best one resource I've seen that's blending those two areas for anyone that's looking for that.
All right. Well, I think that's solid there, and so thanks to our listeners, and I'm sure this isn't the last time Susie and I are gonna do something like this. So I'm looking forward to whatever our next outing might wind up looking like, because I enjoyed the lead up to this, and certainly the live portion of it as well.
Well, I enjoy the opportunity to actually do something with my brain, so thank you for that.
Oh
Anything
yeah.
else?
No, I think that.
What about your site and information?
Yeah. So my site is mentallyagile.com. You can just Google mental agility, and that'll come straight to me. It's got all my contact information on there as well. I'm across all the major social media platforms, however you want to do that. But yeah, so mentallyagile.com. And yours is?
Well, my website is Susie, Susie, Reece, Reece.org. But you can find me on all my social media as the Southern Fried Asian. I'm the original recipe. So
I was going to kick out of that nickname.
yeah, everyone typically does. All of my half Korean friends. Now there's Northern Fried Asians, and there's other Southern fried. So now I have to let
But you're the
people know
original.
right.
Yeah.
So it's fun. All
Well,
right. Well,
cool.
thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to seeing what else we come up with.
Sounds great. Well, enjoy the night, and everybody listening, have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.